I'm Andrea Jones-Rooy, and welcome to Ask a Political Scientist, our very special election season. I am thrilled that you are here with us. It means so much to me that you want to spend your Thursday night thinking about political science as much as I do. So my name is Andrea Jones-Rooy. I am a political scientist. Thank you very much. Hold your applause. And I am here tonight because I love political science. That's right. I'll stand by that statement. My grad school self is disappointed in me or confused, to say the least, but I do love political science, and I am here to hopefully impart that love on others if you don't already love it because you've been watching the show or are generally an awesome person. So we are here to celebrate political science. As a reminder, we are very proudly the third podcast in the world's smartest podcast network. If you haven't already, please check out our partner programs, The Political Orphanage with Andrew Heaton and Lost in America with Turner Sparks and Michael Ira Kaplan. Great shows, funny, insightful, informative. So do check those out. Today is October 8th. One of the main reasons I do this show is to keep track of what day it is. So I believe it's the 8th. And we are here to talk about misinformation. We are going to talk about just how dangerous misinformation is. To me, it seems like maybe the scariest thing that at least we've been talking about on this show so far, but let's leave it to the experts to tell us that. We want to talk about where it comes from, what makes it spread, and how can we correct it, address it, what can we do about it? So those are the questions we're going to be asking. We have two guests tonight. They are some of my favorite people in the whole world, so we are really in for a treat. Our political scientist tonight is Adam Barinsky. He is the director of the Political Experiments Research Lab at MIT. Also, shout out to MIT for the coolest university logo there is. And he has written about 10 million papers and books and so forth about misinformation, political rumors, fake news, public opinion, and we'll be getting into all of that. One of the goals of this show is to get people to go out and read political science articles. And so the article I'm recommending today really is more of a summary article, but he is one of the authors on an article in Science that came out 2 years ago called The Science of Fake News. Addressing fake news requires a multidisciplinary effort. This is a great place to start for an overview of a lot of the research on fake news, misinformation, and so forth. So we're very excited to welcome Adam to the show. Our next guest that we'll be bringing on later in the program is Kasia Patel. She is awesome. She is a science writer at NASA. Maybe you've heard of it. And she also runs DC Science Comedy, which back when we were, outside doing things in large groups, put on really awesome shows across DC that brought science and comedy together. Many of you watching the show who are related to me have been to some of Kasia's shows that I have been on in DC. And they are up to some cool online events as well. So please check out DC Science Comedy. And she was also, no big deal, named one of the best comedians that you have not yet heard of from Thrillist. And we're super excited that she's here with us to help us think about misinformation. Finally, the show is always free. I believe very strongly in getting the good news about political science out into the world as far and wide as possible. But we do welcome donations. If you are enjoying the program and if you are in a position to donate anything, however small, we send all the proceeds 100% straight to different organizations each week. This week, we are very proud to support an organization called Free the PhD, which provides mentorship and career planning to students, in particular those who maybe are looking for non-traditional paths. So I wish I had known about this when I was in grad school. All donations tonight to paypal.me/AskAPS will go straight to Free the PhD to support their scholarship program, which is specifically dedicated to scholarships for first-gen grad students who are single parents, and grad students from underrepresented groups. And just $30 will give one grad student 3 months of mentorship. All right, that's the end of my infomercial, but thanks, Free the PhD, for all you're doing, and thanks for any donations you're able to provide. So let us get into it. We are going to talk first with Adam about how dangerous is misinformation, what makes it spread. Kasia's going to join the show, and we're going to talk together about how we can correct it. And then finally, we want to hear from you. Just like NPR, where you could call in, you can chat in on the live stream and ask any questions of our experts that you want. I guess maybe I'll censor some, but you truly can ask whatever you want, and we will look, we'll see what they have to say. So I'm waiting for someone to ask what the meaning of life is, because I think if anyone knows, our guest today might know. So please send your questions over the live stream, and we will try to get to them all at the end of the program. With that, please join me in welcoming our first guest, Adam Barinsky, to the show. Adam, how are you?
All right, good. Great. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thanks for being here. And thanks for trying to figure out misinformation. How depressed are you on a daily basis? Let's start there.
Well, I've been studying misinformation for about 10 years. So I guess to a certain degree, I'm becoming immune to it. Today's another day, another rumor. Yes, I mean, but it's a huge problem. And that's why I started studying it. I first became interested in it in the summer of 2009 when birther rumors, were starting to spread, in part by our current president. And so I thought I've been studying public opinion, political behavior for about 25 years. And, I felt like even this is crazy. And so I really wanted to sort of dig in and figure out what was going on. And also there was a time there at that same time where death panel rumors were starting, right? This notion that the Affordable Care Act was going to have panels that were going to decide whether or not, we should keep grandma alive or let her go.
Right. Simpler times when it was death panels. I forgot about that. Thank you for reminding me. And I used to I tried very hard to run a nonpartisan show, but I think my own politics are fairly obvious, as the case may be. But I used to try to listen to radio that I disagreed with back in 2009. And I think it was the death panels that caused me to give up on that effort. I think that might've been it. So, okay. So you've been, I'm sorry for you, following, rumors from our president, for example, since the very beginning. So you've been, you knew the misinformation was coming more than we did. There I am being partisan again. But before we go further, we must define our terms. My favorite thing to do, define our terms. So what is misinformation, and is it different from disinformation, fake news, rumors, conspiracy theories? How do we make sense of this tangle of words that we're all using?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interchangeable words. I think that there's a couple key concepts, that sort of to think about misinformation versus disinformation. I think it is useful, right? To think about that the way it's being used by political scientists is in the sense of intent, right? So basically, something's fake, right? It's not true. It's a rumor. It's a conspiracy theory, right? There's a whole bunch of things we can put in that bucket. But then the question is the intent, right? Is it being spread by a particular actor because they're trying to spread misinformation so willfully, or is it just something that people pass along? And so, personally, as someone who studies more the math side of things, I find it's not super helpful to think about information versus disinformation in terms of what people pass on, because if I tell you something that's false and I know it's false, and you repeat it and you don't know it's false, right? Technically, I've given you disinformation and you've made it misinformation. But at the end of the day, right, I think that what's important is that what's out there are presumed facts that are just not true, right? And so I think that, sort of thinking, broadly, as a political scientist, thinking that, when I think about the problem of the mass public, we often talk about how the public is ill-informed, right? They just don't know much about politics. But this is a more dangerous problem because it's that they know something about politics, or they think they know something about politics, and it's wrong, right? And so I think when we think about, what makes misinformation so dangerous, it's not the lack of information, it's the presence of incorrect information that could guide their decisions, their votes, what policies they support.
Right. So have I got it right that so in political science, there is a distinction about intent. So misinformation, I'm willingly trying to mislead someone. Disinformation, I've said something that's wrong, but it wasn't necessarily on purpose. But am I understanding correctly that kind of
the other way around? Yeah. So
the other way around. Okay.
Yeah. So basically, it's about the intent of the person. You think about kind of like the so the Russian misinformation, the stuff that's coming out of, right? So that's disinformation, right? And so we had it in this country where you have them spreading rumors about, sort of in the last election, there were a lot of race-targeted rumors to kind of African-American communities, right, trying to get people sort of to not like Clinton, right? And so right. So we think about it like a disinformation campaign. And this
Right.
is something that has been going on for a long time. So it's actually interesting. In the January of 2016, I went over to Finland to talk about to folks there who are very interested in disinformation and misinformation, because I've been studying American rumors, and they said, we've been picking up these things that are going, these stories that are going around. That's basically the Russian government trying to flood the the media airwaves there with bad stories, right? So like there were stories that the Finnish government were taking the babies of Russian nationals, right? So people who are of Russian origin who are living in Finland, they're taking them to sell the babies to gay couples in America, right? And so, right, so this is that's disinformation.
That's complicated, yeah.
Yeah. So it's well, actually, it gets better because a couple of years later, I went back and I asked about that, and they said, well, they're not talking about that now. The new story is that they want to keep the babies, right, because Finland has a declining population.
I see. I was like, the fixation on babies is confusing,
Yes.
but okay,
yeah. No, I mean, I think it's an emotionally charged thing,
yeah,
in a community, but right. So the Russian government, right, the arm of the army is disseminating this disinformation, and what they hope is not just to get certain people to believe it, but to get people repeating it, right? So even if you don't necessarily believe it, if it so cast doubt, then you start spreading misinformation.
Right.
And, like I said, in this briefing, that as someone who studies more on the math side of things, I don't find it super important. But if we're thinking about the actors who are spreading it, like if this is something that they genuinely believe, then that's misinformation. If it's something that they're trying to sow, right, kind of sow doubt, then so they'll think about Trump talking about the question about is this going to be a secure election? Is voting by mail? Is there huge voter fraud? Right? He might genuinely believe that there is a possibility of massive voter fraud, and actually, it wouldn't surprise me if he actually believed that.
Right.
But this is right. We know that from evidence it's not very widespread. But then you have other actors who are taking that information. Basically, let's sow some doubt here. Let's let's go into the election season thinking like no matter what happens, like something crooked is here. So if Biden wins, it's crooked. Or last time Trump was doing the same thing in 2016, saying basically that there's going to be massive voter fraud, and he ended up winning. And he said, well, I would have won the popular vote if Clinton, people hadn't cheated for her.
Right. I see. So, okay, we're 2 times the charm. So disinformation on purpose, I'm trying to mislead, create confusion, etc. Misinformation, I think it's right, but it's wrong. But your other point is that, look, if we're thinking about the impact on the public, on voters, on public opinion, it kind of doesn't matter which it is because it's wrong and we're acting on it. Is that fair?
Yes, exactly.
I see. Okay. And so is misinformation worse now? And if so, why? Or is it something that we're just hearing about now and has been a part of, say, mass media in all its different forms?
Yeah, I mean, so there's some really good historical studies of. Part of the fun thing about working on this for 10 years is like I get to my hobby is to go read old conspiracy theories, right? But it goes back to the founding, right? In the colonial days, there were rumors spreading around that Native Americans were in league with the French or were in league with the British, right? And so that there's a natural tendency among humans to tell these stories. This is why things like urban legends are so powerful. The kinds of stories that I heard as a kid about like McDonald's has worms in their hamburgers, right? Are the same things that my kids tell today, right? So they're
kangaroo meat, is that the McDonald's one these days? Someone in the chat tell me. Maybe that's just real. I don't know. Yeah.
It could be, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I've created disinformation for your misinformation.
Exactly. Yes.
But I mean, the thing is, like, this has been around for a long time, right? And so, you see this, right, from the early days around the Civil War, tremendous, again, rumor, sort of, the means of transmission were different. But, this is something that, even, sort of in modern social science, people have been worried about. The Hofstadter thinking about the paranoid style in American politics. A lot of that was written in the 50s and 60s resonates today. And of course, the Kennedy assassination. I mean, you can run through this. So, so there's not really so the conspiratorial mindset and the dissemination of rumors is not something new. But I think what is new is how these things spread, right? The ability to find different communities who believe what you do, right? And so like when I talk about things, I often talk about thinking about the description of rumors about JFK's assassination, right? There used to be mimeograph newsletters, right? I'm old enough to know what a mimeograph is.
Yeah, I don't know what a mimeograph. Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about mimeographs over YouTube. Let's
right. So that you could that people would send these to each other. There would be conventions, right? And I think what's changed with the internet is that it's easier to find folks on things like Reddit. So like think about like QAnon, right? Is something that has spread. So you kind of get these hardcore believers who are able to find each other. But I think another part of that is that in talking about it, it's not that so it's not that everyone believes QAnon, but if you hear something enough, then you start to perhaps question, right? So think about like Obama birther, right? There weren't a ton of hardcore birthers who said like, no, I absolutely believe that Obama was born in Kenya, and we have this fake Hawaiian birth certificate and a fake Hawaiian birth announcement, right? And so they kind of down that rabbit hole. But if you get enough people talking about it, then it kind of invades the information environment. So back about 10 years ago, when I first started studying this, I did some polling to ask people, basically, do you think that Obama is a citizen? Yes, no, not sure. And then I would do a follow-up to say, well, what led you to believe this, right? And so what's interesting to me, so of course the people who said that they believe it, like these were the hardcore conspiracy folks who said like, oh, like there's the fake birth certificate. What's really interesting to me is that so that was about 20% of the public, but there's about another 20-25% who said they weren't sure. And it wasn't necessarily that they're like, oh gosh, I don't know. Some people had not heard of it. Other people are like, I hear so much about this. Kind of like, I'm not sure. Maybe there's something there. Kind of where there's smoke, there's fire. Right. So I think that there's two things that are different today. Is that people are better able to find each other and build these communities, just because its connections on the internet are a lot easier. But second, that it's easier. You get these crosstalk of folks who are doing this, and if it gets picked up by mainstream media, the Times and New York Times in 2018 ran a story about QAnon, right? And so that gives it another platform. All summer we heard a lot about QAnon.
Right.
The president talks about QAnon, right? And so it expands out. So it's not just the hardcore believers. This is people who are like, I'm not paying a lot of attention to politics, but something maybe isn't right here.
Is it the case, now I am not a marketing expert by any stretch, but my loose understanding of marketing is basically you've got to make someone encounter your brand or encounter your whatever as many times as you possibly can, and eventually it'll get stuck in their head. Is that kind of the idea with misinformation, disinformation? Is it's not that I'm sitting and being persuaded or I think it's right, it's that I just keep hearing it, and so I say, well, I don't know, maybe they have a point. Is that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it doesn't even have to be that much. When you think about it, kind of like, this gets back to, I said, so I start off by saying disinformation, misinformation doesn't matter. But now I'm going to
okay, like
is the thing is like thinking about the actors, like what is the goal of the person trying to spread, right? This misinformation. So thinking about like Obama's sort of birth certificate, the goal is not to get you to believe that in fact there's this huge plot that's been going around for 50 years to install a Kenyan as the president of the United States. The goal is to get you questioning whether or not this is a legitimate president, right? And so same thing with thinking about voter fraud, all these rumors about voter fraud and finding ballots in ditches and in streams and in mailboxes and trash cans, right? So I don't really care that if you believe those specific stories, if I'm the person who's trying to disseminate the disinformation. What I care about is just getting you to question everything, right? It's sort of like, so going back to that Finnish story, I think what I really like about that story is like, I don't care if you think that we're selling the babies to gay couples in America or we're keeping them to repopulate. Like what I want you, it can't do both at once, right? But those are great. But what I care about is just getting you to question all media, right? And all authority, saying like, what's going on here?
Hmm.
And it's very clear, from, I'm not a disinformation expert, but I talk to lots of folks who are, right? It's kind of like that is the intent. That was the intent in 2016, that Russia thought that, Putin thought that Clinton was going to win, and so he wanted to set up a situation where basically you'd have a huge chunk of the American public questioning whether or not that's legitimate.
Right.
And then, of course, Trump won. But I think that you're seeing similar sorts of things now. I mean, this is why sort of the intelligence community is saying, yeah, Russians are active in this election trying to do the same thing. They think Biden's going to win, so they basically want to undermine. Right? It's not that they want Trump to win. They want America to lose, right? And so by undermining the confidence there. And so we think about, like, in a situation, I'm a good sort of Michigan model guy of political behavior, is that, so most of the people, most of the time, don't pay a lot of attention to the news. And so, if they just sort of casually tune in, right? It's not that I need to, like, keep bombarding you with this until you believe it. Just sort of like you tune in, you're like, oh, that's weird. Like,
right.
Oh.
It's like in the ether, and you're like, that's, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And for folks watching who don't know, the Michigan model is not a dig against the state of Michigan that they don't know what's going on. It's a framework among political scientists who are at Michigan who argued basically what Adam just said, which is that we're not really thinking about politics that much. But occasionally we get this information. So yes, and it is so there's a heavy University of Michigan bias at this show. So happy to shout that out.
Yeah.
Yes. So okay. So is it fair to say that the more dangerous outcome of misinformation, disinformation is this lack of trust either in the media or the institution or the person that it's about, as opposed to the strict persuasion that this particular theory is what's going on? Is that fair?
I think we're thinking about the mass public there.
Yeah.
Think about it, it's just like basically, throwing up a whole bunch of stuff up against the wall, and I don't care what sticks, but if everything I'm throwing up is to undermine your trust in government or your trust in the political process or your trust in elites, then I've won, right? And this was, sort of, I know we're going to talk later about what can we do to correct misinformation. That's a really hard question, because it's like basically, it's like misinformation is the toddler that can just go in and trash everything, right? And
like what do you do? Do you send those toddlers to gay families in America, or where do they go? Yeah,
right. You have to sort of underline that there.
Yeah,
but it's the right. It's like it's easier to break than build up, right? To destroy. And so I think when you think about it, it's sort of like what is the goal there? It's like it's basically to undermine, trust in institutions, right?
So do you think that, as someone who's been studying this for some time, do you think we are in a position, personally for me, it feels like misinformation is a much bigger problem than it was even 4 years ago, though I remember in the lead up to that election, the sorts of misinformation that you talked about, and I remember birther. Is it worse or not? Mm-hmm. And if so, is this a social media story, or to what, or is it a Trump, Russia, geopolitical, or some other kind of political story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say there, okay. So it's
here are the three simple answers for this one. Yes.
Right. Exactly. No, I mean, I think that in some ways, right, it feels worse, right? Is it because we're talking about it more? It's undeniable that the Trump phenomenon has been, sort of changed. But to have, Washington Post does this great count of here's the untrue things that Trump has said, and I can't even remember. Like, I lost count a couple of years ago, but
I have no idea where it is. Yeah, exactly.
Right. It's like it's an order of a magnitude greater than any other president. And so I think that it feels different in that think about like what so politicians typically you kind of spin things, you put a frame on things, like this is part of what politics is. But to have someone come out, sort of in 2016, at a basic level, sort of saying, that climate change is a hoax perpetuated by the Chinese government, and then Trump said, "Well, I didn't say that," and then you roll tape and he's saying it. Right. So I do think that there is something, having the president who basically tells untruths all the time. I think that does make it feel qualitatively different. And so I think that is a big change. But in terms of, sort of like I said, like rumors have been around for a long time. So, are things worse today than in the past? Maybe it feels that way. Like it definitely, I don't know. I was born in 1970, and I feel like, the 90s were like, sort of like, oh, it's kind of a rational time in politics. So since then, everything's been feeling, a lot worse. That's before social media. But yeah.
I don't remember I was born in 82, and so I don't think I appreciated the 90s being rational if they were.
Nor I.
Yeah. Should have the good old 90s. So last question, and then I want to bring Kasia on and talk about what we can do about this. Last question are rumors, conspiracy theories, why do humans like those so much? It sounds, I mean, this isn't unique to Americans. It doesn't sound like what is it a power thing? Is it a fear thing? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, I mean, well, so I think there's a couple things there. Just kind of to say very quickly, like on the one hand, right, that is that sort of that humans are wired to like stories, right, and sort of kind of these flights of fancy, and it's a way that can express hostility. It's a way, kind of an outlet, if people are scared. So, there's like during World War II, for example, there were a bunch of rumors going around about what was going on in Japanese internment camps, where it's basically, the U.S. government was studying, had rumor clinics to try to gather this information. So it's things like, like they get to joyride on tractors, and they get the best cuts of meat, and they get better. And so, I think a lot of this was not that people necessarily thought this was the case, but it's like, we're imprisoning our own citizens against their will. But like, how can I process that? It's like, oh, here's what's really going on. Like they have it good. So like I think
coping mechanism.
There's that. Yeah. So I think there's that. But there's also, I think what's important to know is that, like I've done a bunch of surveys, and not everyone believes rumors and conspiracy theories, right? So there's a continuum. Like there's kind of a tendency toward conspiratorial thinking, right? So I tell people, like think about that relative at Thanksgiving or Christmas or Hanukkah, right?
I have a lot of relatives who watch this show, and I'm not going to tell them which one I'm thinking right now.
Like the one who corners you, right? The uncle, the cousin. Every year they've got a crazy story, right? So that's one end of the continuum. And the other people who believe nothing, right? And so most people lie on that continuum. So like if I ask, I'll ask 8 different conspiracy theory rumor questions. And on average, people say that one of them is true. But there's a skewed distribution there, right? 30% of people say none are true. But that means that 70% of people say at least one thing is true. It's like, like you just showed me a whole bunch of crazy stuff. Why is this rational thing on there? Like, why is that? Which of these don't belong? And so I think it's important to recognize that there is this variation. And as a political scientist, I find that really interesting. But what's more interesting is think about the political implications, right? So it's not all Republicans who think that Obama was born in Kenya, and it's not all Democrats who think that that Trump is faking COVID, right? Which is something I've been hearing. It's Republicans who are kind of high conspiratorial thinkers. Like those are the folks who believe it. Same thing with Democrats there. Because for me, what's a political scientist, what's interesting is thinking about that interaction of politics and psychology, right? To see like who does believe this. So I'd say, so that was a very long answer to your short question, but it's basically saying like, essentially, that there is something, it's a good coping mechanism for humans. Humans like stories, but it's also important to recognize that not everyone takes advantage of this, right? It's not like everyone is running around believing these crazy things.
Right. Now I feel like I want to take one of your surveys just to find out how many things do I believe that are actually totally crazy. Maybe I don't want to know the answer to that.
Okay, I'll send that along. You think?
Yeah, well, I'll take the survey.
You can decide yourself. Yeah.
Excellent. And I also, to be fair, it was a short question, but the question was basically explain human nature to me. So fair. All right. So let's bring Kasia on. She is a science communicator, science writer, and probably deals with misinformation or the correct purveyance of information quite a bit. Kasia, welcome to the show. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me. Very interesting discussion.
Thanks for being here. So I want to ask you, as we're talking about misinformation, disinformation, your job, both, correct me if I'm oversimplifying, both your day job and your comedy job involves communicating science and accurate things to the public. Is that fair?
Yes, I was holding my breath when you said your job is, and I was like,
Yeah.
oh no, what does Andrea think my job is?
Yeah.
Yes, that
Yeah.
is,
It's like you're a dentist, which is why you're here. So yes.
that is general enough to be correct. Yes.
Great. Yes. So perfect. That's gonna be my new tagline, general enough to be correct. It's just like, oh, cool. So is misinformation something that you think about, that you worry about? Have you experienced people taking information that you share and twisting it around and doing things with it?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. And, I'm glad that Adam brought up the two kind of pathways for how wrong information gets out there. I do think that there is a difference between intentional and unintentional. And I work in science, so I'm always writing about scientific studies, science concepts. So I guess what I try to work on with my articles is to make sure that people won't misconstrue it accidentally.
Mm.
When people misconstrue it on purpose or they believe that that's just wrong. I mean, those are when you get into the more conspiracy theorists and the kind of climate denier, science denier type people. So my goal for when I'm trying to write an article, and to be clear, so I do work at NASA, but that is one aspect of my life. I also do.
Your job isn't your whole life, Kasia? Come on. You're un-American. Yeah.
But I also do a lot of freelancing, and I was a podcast host for the magazine called Undark, which is also actually based out of MIT. It's funded by MIT. So I've learned a lot of different things by how other news outlets cover stuff and how I'm covering it, and kind of where the gaps are between that I think I need to fill, at least when it comes to science. Political science, oh man, just listening to you guys and just from what I've seen, especially in the past few weeks, I'm like, oh man, I'm so glad I'm not a political scientist journalist.
I think a lot of people right now are like, we're glad we're not professionally obligated to think about this stuff. So what are some of the things that you either try to do or you think works to sort of help make science communication clear?
Yeah. So when you think about why people are misconstruing a certain study, there are actually a lot of different reasons for that. And especially in science, one thing that I think is actionable is I think a lot of people, especially in general publications, with funding cuts, especially in newspapers, you don't have specific science journalists out there anymore. I mean, we still have the National Association and it's growing and people are doing that. But at a lot of outlets, it's the general assignment reporter that it has to cover this like breaking news or this study that they think is interesting, but they can't really understand the jargon or the science behind it. So sometimes, the journalists don't have time to actually, because they're on deadline, don't actually have time to ask somebody about it. And sometimes it's the scientists who are very shy. There's actually this story that it was for the Undark podcast that I did. And I don't know if you remember this, but every few months there's 2020 seems a little different because it's like every week there's like a new like viral article that's going out. But last year there was an article that said Skrillex playing Skrillex repelled mosquitoes. I don't know if
Like
you.
the DJ Skrillex?
Yeah, the
I
DJ.
stood behind him in a line for a bar at a music festival in Michigan. What doesn't matter. Okay, but playing Skrillex, the important thing is playing Skrillex keeps mosquitoes away.
Right, they were saying that sound, especially Skrillex sound, because it's like kind of
Yeah, it's not good.
harmonious, like very
Yeah.
like, nails on the scratch board kind of.
Yeah, now the Skrillex haters are coming for this show, but okay. This is nonpartisan. Okay, I'm done. Yes. Okay.
Right. But that was on the like front, and that was like on headlines, right? Because it's such a funny thing to kind of go to. And no one was really, when I was reading it, I was like, okay, I know things about mosquitoes. Like this is not how public health works. Like what is
Right.
going on here? And I decided to cover that, and I reached out to the scientist of the study, and he was not US based. So I think that it might have been a little harder for people to reach him, maybe, but he did respond to me. I have no idea why he responded to me, but he said, oh, yeah, I've been getting a lot of requests for this. and people are misconstruing my study. And then I was like, okay, well, did you talk to any of them? He goes, no, 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 no. I don't want to talk to anybody. And I was like, okay, well, you talk to me so that way, like, you can set the record straight that this is not what your study was saying. So he talked to me, but he was so afraid to talk to journalists because I think people are afraid of journalists too. They think that they are going to twist their words. You know, journalism used to be this unbiased, investigative reporting. It was like it was truth. And I feel like a lot of people don't necessarily think of it that way anymore, which is terribly sad, especially because I work in that industry and a lot of my good friends are journalists.
Right.
But that was just an interesting case of, okay, now the scientists need to be better communicators. And I work with scientists outside of my day job to help them communicate better. That's kind of on my comedy side of things.
Right.
And, even since, 4 years ago, you saw kind of this movement in scientists being like, oh, we need to be the communicators because now, all of the science that is established is being threatened by, the president of the United States saying these things that are against this. So that's one way, I guess, is getting the source of the information to be more vocal. So like Dr. Fauci has been absolutely wonderful in that, that he's a reliable source. And I think a lot of people, I mean, I don't know what the statistics say, but it feels like to me that people believe the things that he's saying.
Right. So hearing from him directly as opposed to through multiple sources could be helpful.
Well,
Perhaps.
yeah, I mean, if journalists are fine to hear from, but make sure it's kind of like trusting that process, trusting that journalistic process. And
Right.
I mean, there are, like I said, like Adam was saying, there are people who are trying to intentionally misconstrue your findings. And those are the people that people are wary about, right? So
Right.
every time a scientist, when I used to work in the Office of Communications at NASA, every time we would get an inquiry from a publication that wasn't, super well known, we would do our work and we would say, okay, is this actually journalism? Is this actually going to be, do they have good intentions for actually accurately portraying what the science is saying?
So doing that background work. And it's not something that we all do when we see headlines on Twitter is say, well, who's the source? And did they source? I mean, we should be probably. But let's talk about what both of your experience suggests that we should be doing about this. So I want to start, Adam, you've written a number of papers about fact checking, the consequences of fact checking, and that sort of thing. Is fact checking something that works? Just correcting the misinformation and sending that correction out there? Is that effective?
So yeah, let me start by saying I have great respect for fact checkers. I think it's really important to have someone who's trying to figure out, sort of what is true and what is false. But I think it gets again to this kind of how politicized our time is, right? So thinking about, sort of thinking about fact checkers, that we'd like them to be the neutral referee, right? That comes in and says, someone says this, someone says that, here's the truth. And that works great as long as everyone recognizes that this is a referee. But I think the problem has been, sort of one of the downsides of the last, couple of decades in American politics and polarization is that, right, these aren't necessarily recognized as, right, referees, right? So, so I've talked to people at fact check organizations, and I just say, like, essentially, it's like my, sort of talking to my friends, who have crazy relatives, so like you would say, like, oh, here's something from Snopes, here's something from factcheck.org, right? And the person wouldn't respond by saying, like, oh, okay, I see that right now, that's truth, we're going to move on. They say, like, oh, that's a liberal organization, right? I don't believe that. So the problem is, this is where I said, like, it's really important, like, I'm a political scientist, we should know the truth, but truth is not self-correcting, right? Just sending out that fact check and saying, this organization says that this is true isn't enough to correct that misinformation, right? So in my work, I've thought a lot about how can we kind of leverage different authorities to deliver the message, right? So it's not that we want to have people saying, like, this is true, this is not, but who delivers that message in a way that's effective, right? So to go back to death panels, what I found, I did some experiments where you have nonpartisan sources, so the American Medical Association, the American Association of Retired People, right? So that if you have them correct it, right, it works. But what works even better is having a Republican politician saying like, "Oh, this is crap," right? And so, in the case of my experiments, I use quotes by Chuck Grassley, who was involved in healthcare legislation, who said basically like Sarah Palin has said there's death panels. Like that's just not true, right? And that's the most effective thing that can be done.
So in your work, you use the phrase source credibility, right? So the idea is if you have a credible source for the fact check, then we have a hope that that new information lands and is trusted. Is that fair?
Right. So, but I mean, but the credibility doesn't come about because of expertise, right? And so, think about climate science. I was involved with some stuff at MIT a few years ago, and I talked to climate scientists, and they say, we're MIT scientists. Like this is like people should listen to us. And I would say, like, I absolutely agree, right? That is how the world should work, but that's not how it works, right? Because if you have a politicization of a scientific issue like something like climate change, then just having an MIT scientist come in and say like this is true. So the question is like who delivers that message? So the credibility is not about expertise, but it's about here's why you should listen to me, right? So the Republican source is credible because it's someone speaking out against their apparent interest, right? And so they're basically like, why would this person be saying that there are no death panels when politically it's advantageous, right? It's sort of the other example I give is like when McDonald's used to sell supersized fries, which were basically 2 large fries put together. They never said you should stop eating fries, but they stopped selling supersized fries, right? You could go ahead and get the same amount by buying yourself 2 large fries. But if McDonald's, which makes its money selling French fries, is like, not such a good idea, then that's credible, right? Someone speaking against their apparent interest.
I never know how these shows are going to go. They're live, right? They're unscripted. I did not expect to think about McDonald's as much as I have in the last hour, but I am here for it. So I'm so glad you brought up climate because, Kasia, that was my next question for you. Is climate science, to me, sorry to burst your bubble, I think you might be a political scientist because if you write about climate, it just seems, totally wrapped up in political thinking as well. I mean, correct me if it's not something that you work on, but is that something where you've noticed what Adam is saying, that who is saying it or who is lending credibility makes a difference as far as how the information is received? And I'm also curious how that works even in comedy, right? Audiences on stage believe the person on stage, and so forth.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So yeah, I do write a lot about climate science, earth science. I work in the earth science department, so I'm thinking about climate change a lot.
I bet, yeah.
2020 has been interesting with the fires and the hurricane season and everything else. But yeah, no, climate science is, in terms of credibility, my job is, today I wrote a story about Hurricane Delta. It's going to make landfall on the Louisiana coast, U.S. Gulf Coast tomorrow. And I had to write a story. We got satellite imagery. We did sea surface temperatures, so you can actually see how warm it is. Warm temperatures are important for hurricanes because that's what helps fuel and strengthen and intensify the hurricane. When I'm writing a story like this, where, I don't necessarily need to talk to like the forecaster because, National Hurricane Center does a great job of putting out all that information there. When I'm kind of aggregating this information to write the story about what's going to happen to this hurricane, I'm actually the one looking around at all these different sources and saying, okay, which one of these sources are reliable? And usually, government sources like National Hurricane Center is reliable because, I also know that they use some NASA data. So I trust that data and I trust their scientists. There's a lot of collaboration there. For other stories that aren't as well documented as as hurricanes in the National Hurricane Center, those get a little trickier. And that requires me to actually go into Google Scholar or whatever means I need to and actually read a bunch of scientific studies. And for those, I mean, obviously, source credibility is very important. I look at what else the author has done, and then I'll take what I've learned from them, I'll cross-reference it with what other people are saying, and then I'll email or call other scientists and say, okay, scientist A says this, what do you think's going on? Or does this make sense to you? So it's also, I mean, in journalism, you have these independent sources that you call up, right? And you try and verify them and you try and see if they corroborate and things like that. So, in terms of source credibility, yes, one is like, where is it coming from? But,
Right.
not everyone, we shouldn't only be believing NASA or MIT scientists. And I can tell you there's a lot of very, very wonderful scientists out there at so many different places. But it's also making sure that, okay, does this kind of fit in with the consensus as we know it to this point? Um, Climate science it is interesting. When I got into science journalism, I thought, oh, this is great. Science is based on facts, so I don't need to worry about, people's opinions about the facts.
Fascinating idea that you had.
Like 9 years ago, and
Yeah.
it has so much changed now. But I actually talked to a professor and researcher at George Mason University, and he does a lot of climate communication research. And his name is Dr. John Cook, and follow him on Twitter. And I actually did a podcast episode with him on my podcast, and it's very interesting that he said he looks into why people deny climate change. He actually looks into the facts of what people are saying does not corroborate with what NASA is saying.
Right.
And he kind of discovered, and this is not going to be a surprise to either one of you, but people aren't opposed to climate change they're not opposed that it's happening. They just don't want to believe it because of the solutions that are being proposed. The solutions that are being proposed are very political, and that's kind of informing if and how much people want to believe climate science in general. And to me, that's kind of, that gets beyond the scope of, looking at climate data and looking at, years and years of global warming temperatures and stuff like that.
Interesting. So it sounds like what you're describing is actually reminding me of what, Adam, you said about it being a kind of coping mechanism, right? So the solution for climate problems, I'm thinking even of the debate last night, it's at the expense of jobs, it's at the expense of the economy and so forth. So it's unpalatable. Is this something where and it sounds like just throwing more data about the changing climate isn't going to change anyone's mind, right? So what would, in that case, would it be reframing the solutions, or I imagine, Adam, if Trump said, actually, we really care about this, then that would be great. But short of that, what hope do we have?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, again, it's about delivering the message, right? That, if you say so think about this, the MIT climate scientist, right, who I talked to, is just like, I speak and the facts speak for themselves, right? You want to get people from industry, that kind of people who, sort of, if the argument is that it's going to cost jobs, then you get people talking about, and you saw a little bit of this last night with Harris saying, like, this is going to clean energy, it's going to create jobs, right? That's not a super effective message coming from her, but if it came from someone in Chamber of Commerce or sort of business association, I think it's like that'd be effective.
And it wouldn't be effective, just to be clear, it wouldn't be effective from her in this case because those who are skeptical of climate are not Democrats, probably, and so they're not going to listen to what she has to say.
They're not going to listen, right? But they're sort of like, oh, she's just trying to cover up or something. Right? You're like, oh, she's just kind of talking nonsense there, right? And sort of like she'll say anything to do this, right? But I think the key is that you want someone speaking against their apparent interests, right? Sort of thinking about, like Chuck Grassley and death panels, McDonald's with French fries, like they wouldn't be saying this if there wasn't something real, right? So you get credibility not because of your knowledge or because of your position as a politician. You get credibility because of, the kind of the message you're delivering relative to the message I expect you to deliver. Right.
This is making me think of, so I studied international relations in grad school, and it makes me think of bargaining strategies of costly signals. So I'm going to do something that harms me a little bit or say something that I don't have an incentive to say, and then you're going to believe it.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So costly signaling, right? Just thinking about that.
Right. Okay. I want to make sure we have time for a couple of audience questions. I see some coming in. So question number one, to what degree are disinformation sources consciously malevolent as opposed to actually believing the information, or possibly does disinformation grow and change incrementally as it gets passed from person to person? So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, to Rob, who asked, the question is, so what proportion of this incorrect information that's out there is the result of someone being evil versus someone passing it along? And then the second piece, I think, is, does it kind of become more wrong over time? Like we kind of imagine a chain of rumors. It's less accurate as we spread it.
Yeah, well, I think, again, it gets at this kind of this. So the first person who spreads something, right, that's the disinformation actor. But after, I think that kind of when we think about like connections through the internet is that you very quickly go from that disinformation actor to someone who might spread it because they really believe it, or they might spread it because they don't believe it and they want to undermine position. So I think it's really, I mean, this is why, as someone who studies, I keep saying that, sort of, right. So I started saying I don't like to talk about the difference between the two, and then I made a big point about why it was important. But I think, if you're thinking about,
it depends on the question we're asking. Yes.
Right. Yeah. I just need to be consistent within a question. I don't need to be consistent across questions, right? So, I mean,
also true for debates, but yes. Yeah.
This is saying that what I would say is that it, sort of like once it's out there to a certain degree, it doesn't really matter. I think it's really hard to parse it out. But I think it doesn't matter because like what's going on is looking at the net effect, right? If I tell you something that I know is false and you believe it, or if I tell you something that I don't know is false, but is false and you believe it, it's the same outcome in the end, right? So I think that that's an important thing to think about. And in terms of rumor, changing, I don't know if things get worse or different, but there is this, right, the game of telephone. So this was, Alport, who studied rumors during World War II, would kind of liken rumors to a game of telephone, right? So, I mean, things can change. Do they get better or worse? No, they sort of get different, right? And so, so if you want to go down a rabbit hole, take a look at Google Obama Social Security number. Because there's all these, it's an oldie but goodie. But I'm sure it's still out there. But, there's a certain thing that he has 24 different Social Security numbers, or 86, or 42, right? And it depends where they came from. Like some were from people who died 50 years ago. But basically, so the kernel of the story mutates in different ways. It doesn't necessarily make it better or worse. But in the end, the idea is to say, like, Obama, right? There's something going on with this guy, right? We can't trust him. So I think the net result, as I said, thinking about that in the end is the same.
Right. Right. Kasia, I hope you're joining me in Googling this immediately after the show, or maybe the show will end early so I can look this up. Kasia, have you found that, so as a comedian and in thinking about communicating science through comedy, have you found that humor is helpful for getting people, especially those who, not to keep dragging you into the world of opinions, who might be skeptical or are not inclined to be interested in or would be dismissive of whatever the message is humor helpful to correct misinformation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So earlier when you were asking what are good ways to appeal to somebody to, change their mind about climate change and things, there's also been, I've attended conferences, listened to researchers talk about appealing to emotion. So that's also another way that people try to kind of get in their foot in the front door, right? They kind of appeal to the emotional side rather than the logical side, at least at first. In terms of humor, though, the reason that I'm very passionate about science comedy is I think the cool thing about comedy to me is that it can bridge so many different demographics. Like literally the same thing that would make like me laugh would make like Obama laugh.
I'm thinking about the fly on Pence now. I thought I wouldn't bring it up, but yes, I think we all thought it was hysterical. Yes.
Right. Or like, a person who's still in high school. So to me, comedy has that really special force that you can do that. And what I try and do with my comedy shows is I think when I first started out, I think I was more political with my comedy, right? Where I'm like, climate change is real, that kind of stuff. But then I'm realizing, if I want comedy to kind of work in this way where, there might be someone in my audience who doesn't necessarily think like me, I want to make it a little more neutral, a little more fact-based. So all of my premises are true. And people come up to me afterwards and they're like, hey, I Googled your premise. That's actually true. And they actually learn a little bit more about what they were talking about what I was talking about. So I try and empower people to, and of course, Adam, we have already talked about the issues of Googling things, but hopefully they can find the right sources, and then me being the source on stage, hopefully that can make them think it's correct. But if it can actually change people's minds. So very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, in my podcast with Dr. John Cook, he actually said something very interesting to me, that he's practicing. A lot of psychologists, I guess, do something called parallel thinking or parallel
Okay.
argumentation. So we actually use this in comedy a lot. And basically, it is kind of this what if situation. You establish the logic in one situation, and then you take this logic and put it in another absurd situation and see if that logic holds. And the more absurd the situation is, the better it is for you to drive your point home. I have a joke about a fake moon landing, where I say, like, oh, that's ridiculous because, astronauts brought back moon rocks and there's video. And then I say, I mean, like, I've never seen my parents like mate before, but I know it happened because I'm here and then there's video.
Or you're the moon rock in this.
Exactly.
Got it.
And he's actually been able to change people's minds using parallel argumentation.
Okay.
So I do think that humor has that power, and that people don't expect to get their opinion changed or be educated in a comedy show, and that's what I try and do.
Yes, Kasia shows are very, very sneaky. Very cool. Parallel. What was it? Parallel
argumentation.
Okay. Well, I'm also glad you brought up psychology, because we have another question from an audience member who says, working as a psychologist with psychotic patients, I see a huge parallel with how non-psychotic individuals cling to misinformation and delusional thinking. Is it a spectrum? So I guess this is a parallel in reference to your, Adam, what you described earlier, that there are a few people who believe in conspiracy theories and a lot of people who are just kind of like mostly not at all, or one or two, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So the question, how non-psychotic individuals cling to misinformation. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, to the audience member, the question about, that strikes me is about clinging to misinformation. I mean, what is this about us? Like, it's hard to let go and admit that we're wrong, right? I'm reading a lot about, cognitive dissonance is people think it's at an all-time high, right? What is it about changing our minds or giving up information that's so hard? How can we make that easier for people?
Well, I mean, I think think back to something that Kasia said about, thinking like, how do you change someone's mind about climate science, right? If they're invested in the outcome, right, then that makes it really difficult. And I think that that's why political misinformation is so tricky now, is that we're in a highly politicized time. And again, right, so I guess what you would call a spectrum, so the questioner, I would call a scale, right? And so like people would vary across this. And so, if you have people who are partisan, who also, are very susceptible to conspiracy theory, conspiratorial thinking, but that is dangerous, right? And how can you move them off that? It's really hard, right? Because they're there both because they tend to believe crazy things or implausible things, and because they have strong partisan views that are tied to that particular information. So yeah, that's really hard, right? So like I give talks to lots of different groups, and I always tell them, I said, like, I know you brought me here because you want me to say, here's the 4 easy things you need to do to fix your misinformation problem.
Yeah, we're waiting for the 4 easy things, by the way.
So like that doesn't exist, and anyone who tells you it does is a snake oil salesman. So what I say is, like, basically you got to try a lot of things, right? Kind of just like there is no one magic bullet that's going to fix everything. So my shtick is about sort of credible sources. Other people have looked about sort of, can you get people to go onto alternative stories, right? So it's not just you say this is wrong, you say something like, oh, this is right. And you're thinking also about repetition, right, as a way of doing this. And just and the timing of the correction. Like, do you train people beforehand to be better able to spot things? So David Rand, who's a psychologist at Sloan, and I, actually, it's mostly his work, but looking at basically, can you give people interventions where you basically say, like, beware of misinformation, here's a couple handy tips, right? Just to kind of get them thinking about it. None of these things has a huge effect, right? So, like when I say, like, oh, I can correct misinformation, these are still not huge effects, right? These, they're statistically significant and substantively important, but it's not the magic bullet. So I think, what I would say is to recognize it's a hard problem, because you have people who are prone to this kind of thinking, who believe a lot of crazy things, and are tied into their outcomes there. So
Right.
let's try lots of things.
Right. Okay. And we're at time. I feel like we have much more to discuss. I would just say maybe we can all. I'm inspired by Kasia, all the work that you do to verify sources. And I don't think I'm going to start calling scientists apart from having them come on my shows, but I'm going to do my part to make sure that I'm also reading things from credible sources as well. Finally, I like to ask every guest in the lead up to the election, for each of you, what do you think is going to happen, and when do you think we'll know the result? Right before we sign off, Kasia, why don't you go first? Who do you think is going to win, and when will the election be over?
Oh my
If ever.
gosh, I do not know. I know what I want to happen,
Okay.
but who knows? But I thought I knew what was going to happen 4 years ago, so I don't want to jinx anything.
Okay.
but I'll wink.
Okay.
Mhm.
I'll take it. Very good. Adam, what about you? That's the
Well,
best answer so far.
I'm gonna do the same in that, sort of. I said in 2016 I'm out of the prediction business, but I think the key thing is like, are we going to have a concession speech on election night? My guess is probably not, and so I think it's going to go on for a long time. So maybe that's a backhanded way of getting both those predictions in there. But,
Right.
I think that's what's going to happen.
You both win the prize for avoiding answers. Way to copy the VPs yet again. All the other people on the show are like, oh, this person, that person, November 10th, whatever. So I appreciate your caution. All right, we are past time, so I'm going to let everyone go. Adam Barinsky, Kasia Patel, thank you so much for being on the show. I think folks can find you both on Twitter, and your handles, I think, are both your names, yes?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Great. So follow these two. They're up to amazing things. Thank you both for taking the time. Thank you to all who watched. If you're able to donate, we're sending all our money this week, all our proceeds to Free the PhD, to support scholarships for mentorship for students from underrepresented backgrounds. So every little bit helps. And we are back next week, Thursday, 7 p.m. with Vincent Hutchings from the University of Michigan to talk about racial attitudes and politics. All right. I will see you all next time. Good night.